Content warning for today's video. We're going to be discussing suicide in various amounts of depth, so if that's not something you're quite in the headspace to deal with right now, feel free to stop watching. Remember, you can always come back later. None of us went to church, so we had a lot of time to watch them. The two parents leached of colour like photographic negatives, and then the 5 glittering daughters in their homemade dresses all lace and ruffle, bursting with their fructifying flesh. Somewhere along the plodding journey I've been taking through my 20s, I heard about a book called The Virgin Suicides, and while I can't remember who precisely tipped me off about this novel, I do remember being introduced to it with the aside that it was satire. Concretely, I was told that this book specifically sets out to satirise how women are viewed by society in their best and worst moments, closely examining the way that women are perceived by their male counterparts and their society as a whole. And I was really intrigued by this. The way their actions, no matter how clearly documented and explained, are often reduced to hysteria or womanly whims. The way puberty can often mark an open season on a woman's sexuality. A true satire of the male gaze written by one Jeffrey Eugenides, who I will here on in be referring to as Jeff. It wasn't until a few months later, when it became the monthly book club reading assignment, that I finally got an opportunity to really sit down with this book and sink my teeth into it, and I loved The Virgin Suicides. Published in 1993 with an accompanying movie adaptation released later in 1999, The Virgin Suicides saw its 30th birthday this year. Happy birthday. Focusing on the 5 Lisbon sisters, that's their surname, not their location, The Virgin Suicides chronicles the struggles and deaths of 5 teenage girls over the span of a couple of years during the 1970s. 13-year-old Cecilia, 14-year-old Lux, 15-year-old Bonnie, 16-year-old Mary, and 17-year-old Therese. The youngest sister, Cecilia, attempts suicide in the opening scene with a razor in the bathtub, but is caught and saved. However, she gets her second, more final opportunity at a party that her mum ironically throws to cheer her up by throwing herself out of the upstairs window and landing on a fence post. After this point, the book documents the lives of the sisters, their male counterparts, i.e. the narrator, and the condescending adult presence in their lives. This is the bulk of the story, featuring the boys' observations of the girls over the span of the book's timeline, and the events of importance that took place between them and the girls, like the school dance. 3 of Cecilia's 4 remaining sisters, Lux, Therese and Bonnie, kill themselves together right at the end of the book, with Mary, the overtly religious daughter, being saved by some miracle, again, perhaps ironically, but overdoses on pills shortly thereafter, after being released from the hospital. Rather than having one single narrator, the narrator of The Virgin Suicides is a collective of people. More specifically, the male population of the school. Stories are told as a collection of anecdotes from across a formless mass of middle-aged men, reflecting on their time as teenage boys through a collection of chronologically ordered rumours. Because the book isn't based in the 70s, it's actually set decades later. The boys have become actually quite weird in their late 30s, and the now men are telling their stories and lamenting on how the selfish suicides of these young girls left them with emotional scars that will never really heal. Now, I wasn't quite sure on how to start this video. You might have noticed I didn't do my usual introduction like Patreon, etc. And honestly, if I did that in every video, I'd probably walk into the sea, but it was mainly because I didn't know how to pitch this premise to you lot. This video is going to be about how I misinterpreted a book positively, found some realities, and then reassessed my opinion. And like, where do you start with that? So after some consideration, I just thought we would start at the beginning. Not necessarily of the book, but of my journey with the book, and we'll just go from my initial thoughts through to my conclusion. The panelled walls gleamed, and for the first few seconds the Lisbon girls were only a patch of glare, like a congregation of angels. Then, however, our eyes got used to the light and informed us of something we had never realised. The Lisbon girls were all different people. The Virgin Suicides goes to great lengths to tell us that the 5 sisters, to which the title makes reference, are not the people our narrator thinks they know. Like, several quotes in the book make direct reference to the male narrator's marked surprise when encountering these girls and finding out that they are actually individuals, not gleaming forest goddesses. And while we see this delusion in full force, and we know comfortably that it is delusion, I initially took a great interest in this book because of the way each of the sisters is a big, smelly stereotype. First of all, we have Cecilia, the youngest sister. Nobody's grandfather had died, nobody's grandmother, nobody's parents, only a few dogs. Tomberg's beagle Miffin, who choked on Bazooka Joe bubblegum, and then that summer a creature who in dog years was still a puppy, Cecilia Lisbon. This isn't the only time in the book that Cecilia is referred to as a puppy. After her first suicide attempt, whilst under the obsessive observation of her parents, forced to bathe with the bathroom door open, not allowed outside the house whatsoever, the narrators remarked that the bracelet she wore on her arm would jingle loudly as she moved, reassuring her parents that she was up and about, like an animal collar, although probably a bit closer to a cat. Cecilia's characterization is one that gets some of the most attention from the book, since she's the first person to die. The prologue of the book leads up to her inevitable death, and much of the second third of the book reflects on it. Cecilia wears a wedding dress, like, all day. She just walks around wearing a wedding dress that she has cut short to sit just above her knees. In fact, she wears that dress every single day, as we learn during some of the observations the boys make at her funeral. She was dressed not in a wedding gown, but in a beige dress that she had refused to wear in life, which implies to us their surprise in seeing her wear something else. And when the boys attend the party that the Lisbon's mother throws for the girls, the party that Cecilia will kill herself at, she sits, and the shapeless bag of the dress fell over her, with lips coloured with red crayon, giving her a deranged harlot look, but she acted as though no one were there. Cecilia's physical appearance gives us the visual impression of a girl who has simultaneously been sucked up into adulthood, forced to bear the weight of it, but will never fit into it. She's too small to fill it out, and she's too sickly and pale to glow, and she never will be. Cecilia is a character that I really enjoy, no matter how quickly she is expunged from the narrative, and that she is only documented speaking once in front of our narrator, although her words aren't even worth quotation marks. We are just told she was asked if she could be excused, and they were surprised by the maturity of her voice, that she sounded old and tired. I like Cecilia and her portrayal, like, a lot. I feel like she's a distant, wispy, gowned widow who stands at the window looking out to sea, wondering when her husband will be back from the war. And don't get me wrong, her portrayal is caricaturish, but I thought that it was intended to be so, hence the satire. I find her portrayal exaggerated and silly, like a sad mime doing a weird bit of performance art, like a wraith haunting the Lisbon household. When Cecilia comes to take her own life, we have this distinct impression that she sticks out in her weird wedding dress, the weird sibling, the ghost at the feast. Like her wedding dress, like the adult life looming over her like a shadow, Cecilia doesn't fit in at the party. She jumps out of the upstairs window and impales herself on a fence post. The boys remarked that a few of us had fallen in love with her, but we kept it to ourselves, knowing that she was the weird sister. Lux is the seductress nymphomaniac, and yes, I am saying that as tongue-in-cheekly as I possibly can, don't worry, she's 14. The boys remark, Lux Lisbon was the only one who accorded with our image of the Lisbon girl. She radiated health and mischief, her dress fit tightly, and when she came forward to shake our hands, she secretly moved one finger to tickle our palms. Even decades after their death, they refer to these girls explicitly through our image of them, their ownership, their perspective, their mould. Even in death, these women have no autonomy. While Cecilia is the bedraggled war widower, Lux is the frisky, devilish, titillating minx who will do anyone and anything. The succubus, the whore, the men writing women fiasco. Lux is particularly interesting, not only because she is easily the character that the narrator focuses entirely on, with Cecilia in close second and the other three girls almost laughably neglected by the story, but also because of the depths of her exploration through the eyes of her male admirers. Lux is open season, Lux is public property. Lux's description is deeply uncomfortable, and again intentionally so. One of the boys steals one of her used tampons from the bathroom and keeps it, immediately sprinting off to tell the rest of the boys that Lux was bleeding between the legs that very instant. The men, speaking in the present tense, wistfully recall how they came to hold collective memories of times we hadn't experienced, harboured private images of Lux leaning over the side of a ship to stroke her first whale. Later in the book, when Lux is sent to the emergency room for what is strongly implied, if not directly stated, to be a pregnancy, and receives a complete gynecological exam, the documents of which these grown men continue to hold amongst their most prized possessions, having been gifted by a hospital clerical worker who clearly does not understand the concept of privacy or confidentiality. Lux's characterization is tragic, and intentionally so. The men telling us the story of these sisters refer to a doctor, Dr. Horniker, a man who isn't especially brilliant with any of these women, but at least observed that Lux's promiscuity was a commonplace reaction to emotional need. Lux confused sexual intimacy with love, and for her, sex became a substitute for the comfort she needed as a result of her sister's suicide. And this quote kinda spoke to me, it really did. As we explore the Lisbon family as a whole, we learn that their mother is extremely cold. No hugs, no physical contact at all, touch-starved, love-deprived. These sisters are locked away in the family home as their mother became more paranoid about them harming themselves the way Cecilia had done. And I feel like exploring Lux's need for intimacy and closeness through these moments of misplaced physical love was a fair exploration to embark on. I thought it was quite valid. Lux somehow manages to get a mattress onto the roof and somehow manages to get men into the house, older men, like in their 30s. She sneaks them through the house and up onto the roof and has sex with them, and her schoolmates all watch it. These sad freaks even comment that even now we have to admit that it's always that pale wraith we make love to, no matter what our present lovers are doing. Despite how bluntly ridiculous that entire concept is, sneaking older men into the home, up onto the roof, past her paranoid parents to have sex with them, you know, whatever, let's just say that it was the only way that we could expect our narrators to know that she was consistently sexually active with multiple partners. Fine, or maybe it was even a false memory or a rumour that was lost amongst the truth. Whatever. I did quite like Lux's exploration. As I said with Cecilia, Lux is a caricature. She is an exaggerated portrayal of budding femininity, exploring sexuality, and the victim of the projected feelings that her classmates had. Lux's romantic and sexual development is so public and so core to the story that she ends up briefly dating, the word dating being a huge exaggeration, one of the only named characters in the book, Trip Fontaine. And not only is Trip one of the only named characters, but unlike other named characters who are quickly referenced and then left to fall by the wayside or ignored for long periods at a time, Trip gets the most narrative exploration out of any character in this story. I would argue he gets more than the sisters themselves. Trip is a glow-up kid, someone who was apparently very ugly but blossomed so hard in his teenage years that he was leaving nightly notches in his bedpost. 418 sexual partners, we are told specifically. And Trip takes an interest in Lux that he has the privilege of telling us about firsthand, which I think makes it seem like more of an innocent fascination than it is. He notifies the narrator, somehow both separate from them but also a member of the chorus, that I never got that girl. Never. He leaned towards her, grinning, and even though he had never said anything intelligent within our hearing, he made Lux laugh. He seemed to know what he was doing, and we were astounded at the knowledge he had gained in the basements and bleachers of his delinquency. He crumpled a dead leaf over Lux's head, bits fell down the back of her shirt, and she hit him. Lux, from what we can gather from what is almost certainly a third-hand source, is pretty smitten with Trip. Writing his name on her underwear in water-soluble marker and sneaking out of the house into his car at the mercy of her mother, she falls on him in a way that is described animalistically. When Lux rendezvous with Trip in his car, he describes her actions as one of a starved animal whose watermelon gum he found himself chewing after a few torrid kisses. He felt her clammy shins, her hot knees, her bristly thighs, and then with terror he put his finger into the ravenous mouth of the animal below her waist. He felt fur and an oily substance like otter insulation. We learn about her pulpy lips, blind sideburn fuzz, and her nose with its candy pink translucent nostrils, and we learn these recollections through Trip himself. I don't think that those are the words of somebody who actually finds Lux beautiful. I think Trip has the benefit of telling the story his way. He tells us he's enraptured by her, but we never learn why. We never learn anything about who Lux is as a person through him. What she likes, what she was like, what she talked about. All we know is this skewed impression of her hypersexuality, which could either be a lie or wishful thinking on behalf of the man who openly admits that he can't get over her. Furthermore, the sex he describes between the two of them sounds weirdly off-putting and unpleasant. Yeah, sex isn't perfect, and it's got goop and noises and textures that we don't expect, but Tripp describes Lux like a dirty beast, and not in a sexy way. Similar to how the boys see Cecilia as a lost little dog, Lux is some horny werewolf, as dangerous as she is aggressive. Unclean, filthy, smelly, hairy. Like when you put your hand under a desk and accidentally touch something wet. Like the shit that clogs your sink. But man, you would think 30 years after losing the girl he never got over, with all that time to romanticize it in his head, finally telling his male counterparts about these experiences, he would have more to remember than bristly thighs and pulpy lips. While Lux clearly has a reputation amongst the boys at her school, regardless of whether or not it is based in fact, she has no power over how her story is told. I think that's what gives her characterization so much strength, lending itself to bolstering the quality of the book overall. Lux is the epitome of the sexualized love interest. Described in potentially misguided articles about the book as a manic pixie dream girl, Lux has some really serious shit going on for a teenage girl. But we only learn about her through her sexual intrigue and the glimmer of hope these men have that she will take pity on them and let them look up her skirt for a bit. I did catch glimpses in the story, some way more overt than others, that their bond was nothing more than Tripp's brief fascination with the girl who is locked away, like a Rapunzel fetishist. Tripp had dibs on Lux when the boys went to pick up the sisters for their school dance, and I say dibs with heavy quotations. He grabbed her while the other boys marvelled at which girl is which, but by the end of the night, when everyone else gets in a cab and heads home safe, leaving Lux and Tripp to make goo-goo eyes at each other, it's Tripp that just abandons her and walks home. He doesn't put her in a cab, he doesn't get her home safely. He, quote, says, "Didn't care how she got home, he just took off. I liked her, but I just got sick of her right then." None of the narrators give pause to assume whether Tripp's act here was what sealed Lux's fate. Her final connection with the outside world lost, we never see how deeply he hurts her, and none of the narrators care. Speaking of cars, the car in the garage becomes Lux's chosen method of taking her life. She brings the boys over and leaves them in the kitchen while she walks into the garage and does the whole exhaust gas trick. Is it her way of taking back control, mirroring Tripp driving off and leaving her alone in the night to wander home? She gets in the car and abandons them there and then. Is this Lux's final act of autonomy, bringing these people into her house full of hope and creepy lust, only to effectively abandon them the way that she was abandoned? Is it her only act of autonomy? Bonnie is the middle child, and is one of the two most neglected sisters in the narrative, which I initially felt was intentional. She is often described as meek, she rarely talks, but also the boys only ever seem to fixate on her big nose and, as far as I can remember, chubby physique, so I feel like she is intentionally neglected from the narrative because she is neither the wispy, tragic figure of Cecilia, nor the exciting seductress that is Lux, so Bonnie doesn't really pose much of an interest to any of the boys narrating. Bonnie is barely present for any of the main events of this book beyond her own death, but she does have one notable inclusion during the scene where the boys take the girls to the school dance. When Lux goes to sit behind the bleachers and drink with Tripp, Bonnie doesn't want to leave her alone and follows, only to wind up in a situation of peer pressure. Her own date takes some alcohol into his mouth and then kisses her, forcing the alcohol into her mouth, which is gross, but poor Bonnie sits there with her teeth held together, grinning like a skull. The men in the moment look back on Bonnie and describe her specific mannerisms and body language. She's clearly uncomfortable, scared, upset, but they never acknowledge what an issue it was. They never have that clarity, even when they are literally likening her face to a morbidly amused, decomposed corpse. It's like they see it, but they also don't see it at the same time. The reality of Bonnie perseveres beyond her death. The boys discover her whilst messing around in the basement at the house at the crescendo of the story. One of the boys, Buzz Romano, dances through the flooded basement, announcing to the others, "These girls make me crazy. If I could just feel one of them up just once," only for the rest of the boys to notice Bonnie's hanging body above him in the balloons against the ceiling. This scene is played like a punchline to a joke, and I found it pretty distasteful, even on a meta level. It's a veritable she's behind me, isn't she moment where Buzz accidentally speaks incredibly ill of the dead, while a 16-year-old girl's body swings lifelessly on a rope above his head, and the rest of the boys stare at him in horror, waiting for him to notice. For the girl who was not noticed in life, it's a miserable way to go in death. Surrounded by balloons, in a party room, dressed in a pink dress, hanging literally off the ceiling, and still nobody cared to notice that she was there. Unlike Bonnie, Mary gets a little bit more screen time or book time along her more popular sisters. Mary is the religious one. She's pious and devout. She has kind of an angular blank characterization to her, like a sheet of paper with corners and featureless faces. The boys remark that she held herself very straight, like Audrey Hepburn, whom all women idolize and men never think about, which is true, as you can tell from my demure doe eyes. I adore Audrey Hepburn. She is my role model. Despite her religious characterization, Mary can't escape the eyes on her, just like her sisters. In the present day, one of these creepy little troglodytes introduces a photograph of Mary, describing the scene as Mary caught in the act of blow-drying her hair. The voyeuristic angle these men romanticize the girls through makes every action sexual. Every activity Mary partakes in has a titillating angle to it, like it's a secret sexually charged moment. I suppose it could tragically link back to her A4 characterization. Mary's a blank piece of paper, all edges and cuts. But it feels like the men of the narrative just pick her up and draw all over her, deciding how her actions were intended when even the opposite is clearly true. And Mary seems to be rewarded for her piety in the most tragically ironic way. When the sisters all take their lives together at the same time at the end of the book, Mary sticks her head in the oven, and by some cruel miracle, she is the only one who survives. As the last Lisbon sister, she lies on the floor in a sleeping bag for the better part of a month, grieving her sisters and grieving herself, before ultimately overdosing on a bottle of pills. None of the boys made an effort to reach out. In fact, they were already referring to her in the past tense, as though just waiting for her to get over it and die. Makes a joke of all their pontificating over how much they wished they could have saved her. Therese is the oldest sister at the ripe old age of 17, truly a fossil. I'm again kidding. Although as the least present and developed character in the book, I did wonder if that was intentional. She's like an old maid who is no longer worth notice, like she's basically old enough to be the perfect casting to play someone's mother in a Marvel movie. It felt stereotypically, satirizingly fitting for her to be neglected this much from the book. In the final moments of the story, Therese overdoses on sleeping pills and is not given much consideration whatsoever by the narrators afterwards. I think these characteristics for me really broke the mould in terms of satire, with each one of the Lisbon sisters seeming to shine a light not only on the way teenage girls are seen by society, but also shone a light on all the different things a teenage girl could feel on any given day. A girl expected to act like a grown-up whilst simultaneously constantly being condescended to. A girl whose body is public property the second she starts puberty. A girl who is unattractive. A girl who is too prudish to be allowed to escape her objectification. And a girl who is aged out of relevance. What worked for me about the Lisbon sisters is that I have been every single one of them to varying degrees. And I assume this is the same for a lot of other readers too. As a result, despite the story being told through the male gaze with the intention of obscuring details and giving an exaggerated, slanted perspective on a group of women who never get to tell their side of things firsthand, I, and presumably so many other people reading it, could see through this. And I think that's what good satire is. Played straight enough by a narrator to tell a compelling story without being clear parody, but with enough depth that any competent reader can step into the scene and understand the reality of it for themselves. Unlike those silly stories like Animal Farm, which are just about animals on a farm and nothing else. But, you say, Kirsty, lots of media parodies womanhood. Why is this any different? And I ask you, why do you feel so comfortable using my first name? And you reveal that you've been stealing all of my posts for months, and I finally understand why my credit rating is plummeted. But I answer your question because the Virgin Suicides demonstrates to us not only the borderline parody of how women are belittled at every stage in their life, especially in their teenage years, for any standout quality considered notable, but also how that intrinsic mystery and romanticization of womanhood links so clearly with the intrinsic mystery and romanticization of suicide. Each Lisbon sister kills themselves in a different way, but more importantly, each Lisbon sister's death is described, analysed, and mused upon in a different way. Can 5 sisters all become clinically suicidally depressed within a year of each other? Was it genetic, something passed down to them in their DNA that gave them a predisposition to depression? Was it nurture? We see a rough tapestry of their home lives, and it is not nice. Their mother is a kind of desperate, controlling woman who treats them like disasters waiting to happen, temptations for men, ornaments of chaos that can't be trusted with the most basic things. She treats them as women who need to be kept indoors, isolated from their peers, fed miserable bland food, given nothing to do, indefinitely, until they break down completely and take their own lives. Why do they not run away? Well, we never learn why. I'm not sure it's possible to understand through the perspective we're given. In fact, we will never understand because of this. Each story these boys tell may as well be rumours. The stories about being under the bleachers at the school dance, the rendezvous in cars, waving out of windows, leaving cards around the town to be found. None of them are verifiable. The story is written entirely by a cluster of people who remember sequences of events in no particular helpful order, slotting them together now, 20 years later, and tragically we will never know the girls because of this. But more to the point, while we sit and watch these young men sit and watch the world around them, at which we watch these girls spin awkwardly at the center like a neutron star, I don't know anything about space, please correct me, we sit and watch them miss the point, and everyone around them misses the point. No one ever draws attention to what is there, right in front of us, their home lives, their isolation, their depression. Instead, we hear ridiculous theories, and not just from anyone, but from their doctor, analysing their handwriting, because you know all doctors are somehow experts at handwriting analysis too, coming to the conclusion of them being emotionally unstable dreamers, out of touch reality. When Cecilia jumped from that window, she probably just thought that she'd fly. This mirrors the way that we see clearly the reality of the sisters' humanity, but the men who tell the story of their lives are no less deluded than the professionals that quarrel over the fantastical, hysterical, womanly pseudoscience behind their deaths. Despite the intention of this book to satirize the way people overthink suicide in its wake, like trying to put together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that were never going to fit in the first place, said phenomenon doesn't occur hugely across the book. Rather, these moments, as Jeff describes, of psychobabble only get a few minutes here and there of discussion. Instead, this mostly occurs in the wake of Cecilia's suicide. Officially, Cecilia's death was listed in church records as an accident, as were the other girls a year later. When we asked Father Moody about this, he said, "We didn't want to quibble. How do you know she didn't slip?" When the boys bring up the various ways the other sisters killed themselves, Father Moody continues, "Suicide, as a mortal sin, is a matter of intent. It's very difficult to know what was in those girls' hearts and what they were really trying to do." When visiting the doctor, the boys are told, concerning Cecilia again, she was a dreamer. Look at the state of her handwriting. Clearly, she assumed that she would fly if she jumped. When the local TV station picks up their stories, opportunity arose for them to make it a big deal, and so they ran a show focused on the subject of teenage suicide, and that show was called 13 Reasons Why. I'm kidding. Instead, the boys described a fairly dry-sounding segment. They invited 2 girls and 1 boy onto the show to explain their reasonings for attempting suicide. We listened to them, but it was clear they'd received too much therapy to know the truth. Their answers sounded rehearsed, relying on concepts of self-esteem and other words clumsy on their tongues. Which does beg the question on what Jeff considers psychobabble to be. At first I thought he meant things like goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's kind of shit, you know, I thought he meant pseudoscience, but turns out he just means therapy, and as a firm believer in the benefits of therapy and a frequent attendee, I find that therapy often provides you with more clarity, not less, and it gives you an abundance of tools that you can use to pick through your feelings and identify the root cause of them. I would say that after going in and out of therapy on and off for the last decade, I have been far better equipped to describe my mental state and decision making than without it. Perhaps the reason the boys find the kids on the TV show to be clumsy with their words is because they've never had the words to describe these feelings before. Just because you don't know what the word is for something doesn't mean you don't have to deal with it. I know I'm off topic here, but I found it really frustrating the more I realised that Jeff considers therapy to be some kind of grooming tool used to lead teenagers further away from themselves and obscure their own understanding even further. He seems frustrated by the fact that suicidal depression can be caused by things that have names, and he seems very insistent that No, we can't put any words on anything that anybody was feeling. It's simply a mystery. And I found that counterintuitive to the very satire that he was trying to deliver. The boys summarise, we didn't understand why Cecilia had killed herself the first time, and we understood even less when she did it twice. In the wake of Cecilia's suicide, Lucy Brooke, who I believe is a friend or classmate of the girls, but I could be wrong, was petitioned by the boys to go and snoop around Cecilia's room for them. She said their sheets hadn't been cleaned, the room was left intact as if it were an exhibit, the window from which Cecilia jumped was still open. In the top drawer, Lucy found 7 pairs of underpants, each dyed black with RIT. Neither of these things surprised us. We had long known about Cecilia's black underwear because whenever she'd stood up on her bicycle pedals to gain speed, we had looked up her dress. Even in death, the girls do not get a break from the narrators of this book, and I think the collective nature of this narrator goes great lengths towards enforcing that feeling. They are all men observing these 5 girls from every angle. All day and night, they either know what the girls are doing, or they are hungrily trying to understand what they are doing. These girls never know peace. Even after they die, their bodies, belongings, and even memory are owned, coveted and desecrated by the men who idolize them, like maggots on dead flesh. This is especially showing during a recount from one of the boys who were able to interact with one of the girls posthumously. Kurt Van Osdol, the only kid at the funeral home, said he would have copped a last feel right there in front of the priest and everybody if only we had been there to appreciate it. And just to be clear, that quote is about Cecilia, the 13-year-old. Even Cecilia's diary is stolen from their house, passed to these locust men, with these middle-aged men later admitting, we know portions of the diary by heart now. After we got it up to Chase Buell's attic, we read portions out loud. We passed the diary around, fingering the pages and looking anxiously for our own names. I do really like this passage because it tells us that the individual experiences of these girls isn't even remotely what these men are interested in. They are interested in themselves, seeing themselves represented, projecting the same romantic rapture they feel onto the girls. They spend so much time thinking about these girls that they can only hope and assume that the girls feel the same way about them in turn. As a result, they skim through the journal, ignoring the lived experiences of now dead teenage girls, because they were never the priority in the first place. In fact, the sisters' private lives are of so much importance to this wider group of people that they are basically considered to be public property after death. When Mr. Lisbon pulls the curtains on the living room window closed, presumably because a horde of young men won't stop staring at his daughters, the collective narrator refers to the shadows of the girls against the curtain as incarcerated, like they are some public good that has been wrongly imprisoned. I mean, if I was their dad and I heard the boys insist they were going to get into the house and see things more unthinkable than before, that they were going to watch those girls taking showers, I would probably feel similarly hesitant. Even in the comfort of their own home, the Lisbon girls are dogged and harassed, unable to even resist. We hear stories of the boys sneaking into their home, wandering around, gaining access, then coming back to us with stories of bedrooms filled with crumpled panties, of stuffed animals hugged to death by the passion of the girls, of a crucifix draped with a brassiere, of gauzy chambers of canopied beds, and the effluvia of so many young girls becoming women together in the same cramped space. They even remark on the lack of douches in the house, suggesting that they assumed girls douched every night, like brushing their teeth, until Sisson, one of the boys, told them of a great discovery. One Tampax spotted, still fresh from the insides of one of the Lisbon girls. Sisson said he wanted to bring it to us, that it wasn't gross, but a beautiful thing. You had to see it like a modern painting or something. I like the way that they suggest that if Father Moody had not been a priest and looked, because it implies that his title is the only thing that keeps him from violating the private spaces of school children. He would have seen the throne-like toilet where the Lisbon girls defecated publicly. Despite having clarity in their hands, maybe even answers in the journal, we will never know, the boys, now men, can only reminisce on them in romanticized terms, referring to them as warm, loving, hot water bottle women, which is arguably false on all fronts. They were short, round-buttocked in denim, with roundish cheeks that recalled the same dorsal softness. Whenever we got a glimpse, their faces looked indecently revealed, as though we were used to seeing women in veils. There's a hesitance in the narrator to ever recall these women as individuals. They will spend pages ruminating on the warm and loving presence of these teenage girls, dedicating dedicate an inordinate amount of time 30 years later to talking about how soft their bums are, and yet feel a degree of shame when faced with their faces. In contrast to the girls' backsides, which are described in uncomfortable and extensive detail, seeing their faces feels indecent, as though we were used to seeing them in veils, like their faces should be covered. Maybe it's because the narrators don't want it to be confronted with the fact that they continue to obsess over and sexually fantasize about dead children. Food for thought. They remark that, despite everything, the girls had continued to develop. In the Krieger's basement, we lay on a strip of leftover carpeting and dreamed of all the ways we would soothe the Lisbon girls. Some of us wanted to lie down in the grass with them or play the guitar and sing them songs. They observed that our interest in the Lisbon girls only increased in the few days after their funeral. Added to their loveliness was a new mysterious suffering, perfectly silent, visible in the blue puffiness beneath their eyes or the way they would sometimes stop mid-stride, look down and shake their heads as though disagreeing with life. Grief made them wonder. Technically, Mary survived for more than a month, though everyone felt otherwise. After that night, people spoke of the Lisbon girls in the past tense, and if they mentioned Mary at all, it was with the veiled wish that she would hurry up and get it over with. The men hijack the tragedy of the Lisbon family and place themselves in the centre of it, like a smug sun. Although they don't necessarily enjoy the sequence of events that have taken place, they do relish them. Almost like the deaths of these girls was an opportunity for them to wax lyrical about their own emotional development, not realising that the more they talk, the weirder we find them. In complete honesty, I'd rather spend 8 minutes with a grizzly bear than find myself in an alleyway with any of these chumps. Okay, maybe not 8 minutes, but you get the gist. Every suicide is treated with extreme disrespect and overt voyeurism. The boys watch Cecilia get carted out of the house into an ambulance on a stretcher, and they regard her as a tiny Cleopatra on an imperial litter. Like she's a highly sexualized, tragic, historical queen, and not a 13-year-old girl who has just made a life-ending decision. Under the molting trees and above the blazing, overexposed grass, these four figures paused in tableau. The two slaves offering the victim to the altar, lifting the stretcher into the truck, and the drudge virgin rising up on her elbows with an otherworldly smile on her pale lips, they recite. Like Cecilia's act was some kind of performance art intended to titillate. She is used continuously by the men for their own entertainment, never given peace, always pestered to entertain them in the most abstract way. And it was then Cecilia gave orally what was to be her only form of suicide note, and a useless one at that, because she was going to live. Obviously, doctor, she said, you've never been a 13-year-old girl. Lux's suicide is probably the most egregiously written, if we were to be ranking these on egregiousness. She came up to chase Buell, she came so close her breath stirred his hair, and then in front of us all, Lux unbuckled his belt. She didn't even need to look down. Her fingers saw their way and only once did something snag, at which point she shook her head, like a musician missing an easy note. Lux faints as though she's going to suck this man off in a room in front of all of his peers, before smiling mysteriously and floating out of the room, asking for a moment before walking into the garage and suffocating herself in the car. I found this a little bit less satirically sound, being that Lux's actions aren't framed as anything beyond what she's actually doing. Like, this isn't a scene that we walk into and see the reality of. She is actually just seducing these men in her final moments. Like, one last fling before she goes. While most of this book has us observing the girls through the perspective of the men, and therefore we are well aware that the scenes and perspectives are being twisted accordingly through time and bias, this is one of the only times in the book where Lux just acts. And she acts in a frantically manic pixie dream girl manner, making this scene feel icky and exploitative, and not in a way that the book is intending to shine a light on. She had escaped in the car just as we expected, but she had unbuckled us, it turned out, only to stall us so that she and her sisters could die in peace. Unlike Lux and Cecilia, Therese's only acknowledgements in the story come post-mortem, when a minute later they were carrying Therese out face down. Her dress, hiked up around her waist, revealed her unbecoming underwear, the colour of an athletic bandage. The back of her dress had popped open to reveal a slice of mushroom-coloured skin. Even in death, they can't give Therese dignity. reality, either in the way they romanticized Cecilia in her stretcher, nor in the way they physically described these girls as ethereal goddesses. Except Therese, obviously, the old maid, the forgotten one. Therese's position and hiked up dress gives an air of cringe, difficult to watch, uncomfortable, and secondarily a source of secondhand embarrassment and self-awareness. After spending the bulk of this book ogling the girls, never giving them a second of space or privacy, these men regard Theresa's fresh corpse with disdain and cold honesty. The newspapers, later writing about what they termed a suicide pact, treated the girls as automatons, creatures so barely alive that their deaths came as a little change. The core theme of this book, as stated by Jeff himself, is the romanticization of memory. The way that after a suicide, people, especially media, will spin all sorts of random sentiment. I think this is pretty effectively done in the book, often to the point where it can just be interpreted as being played completely straight. It's so deadpan. While there are some aspects of this book that I'll discuss later that I don't feel came from a place of innocent and well-intentioned exploration, this is one of the themes that is written so well that it is easy to confuse it with Jeff's actual opinion on the matter. I guess because it's just so overt, you know? The way that the boys, now men, still talk about how much they tried to remain true to the girls, to keep their memory pure, that we continue to think about them but they were slipping away from us. Taking the 5 deaths of these young women who actually didn't seem to know or care about these boys that much at all, placing themselves in the centre of it, and assuming a greater weight on their shoulders than there actually was in reality. Especially as older men now looking back, they talk about the images we treasured of them in their bathing suits, jumping through a sprinkler, beginning to fade. No matter how religious we meditate on them in our most private moments, lying in bed beside 2 pillows belted together to simulate a human shape. Yes, definitely healthy protagonists. The idea of these men being so deluded by their one-sided perspective of a love they never had, that they fall into some state of arrested development, romantically and sexually, is as uncomfortable to read as it probably was to write. Like, the deaths of these girls triggered some kind of innate paedophilia, but specifically only for these girls. They crave the memory of these girls specifically, probably barely remembering them as it is. Over the years, of course, the open mouths of women have blown into our faces ingredients of that original smell, and occasionally poised over unfamiliar bedsheets in the dark of that night's betrayal or blind date. We've greedily welcomed any new particular reek because of its partial connection to the fumes that began blowing from the Lisbon house shortly after it was closed up and never really stopped. Even as older men, they still fantasize about these girls, and flipping pages, hiked through dusty passes with the girls, stopping every now and then to help them take off their backpacks, placing our hands on their warm, moist shoulders and gazing off at papaya sunsets. We drank tea with them in a water pavilion above blazing goldfish. We did whatever we wanted to, and Cecilia hadn't killed herself. She was a bride in Calcutta with a red veil and the soles of her feet dyed with henna. The only way we could feel close to the girls was through these impossible excursions, which have scarred us forever, making us happier with dreams than with wives. One man's hopeless romanticism is another man's creepy obsession, I suppose. Honestly, and I am ashamed to say this in hindsight, but I was initially quite frustrated by my book club. I was stunned that we had been handed a heaping platter of solid gold satire, one of the most comprehensive and insightful examinations of female adolescence and tragedy through the eyes of men, who are kind of reflecting on having been raised to see them as wholes. And my book club was treating it like it was being entirely played straight. I was frustrated because whenever we talked about it, they'd spend all their time knocking it, not giving it a chance, and never reading beyond surface-level observations of the now middle-aged men who were observing, romanticizing, and sexualizing these young women. I felt irritated that we had been given one of the most understanding depictions of adolescence, and it was being treated like a paedophile's manifesto. When I raised my concerns to the group, they were equally as confused. Satire? They asked. What are you talking about? So yeah, this book isn't exactly satire. I mean, it is a bit, but not nearly in the ways that I thought it was. With a mounting feeling of discomfort in my stomach, I whacked "Is the Virgin Suicide Satire" into Google and waited for it to load. In a 2013 interview with Days Digital, Jeff is asked about the satirical nature of his book. It is satirical, he assured us. It's about the unknowability of suicide, that you can never pinpoint the reason why someone commits suicide. It's about newspapers and societal trends and psychobabble, he explained. We're drawn to suicide because of how mysterious it is, he explained. You can't figure out exactly why someone went to that length, and that mystery is increased if the person is young and seemingly has so many reasons to live. I mean, I'm sure we can agree to disagree, Jeff, but go off. Even the title of the book ambiguously harkens back to that. Jeff was really thinking about how the suicides might have been called in a tabloid or magazine, and that the Virgin Mary, which is on a card that appears around the town and reinforces the Catholic nature of the Lisbon family, has lots to do with religious imagery and suffering, perhaps more so than physical virginity. In terms of satirising mental health, suicidal romanticisation, and, in Jeff's words, psychobabble, this was pretty spot on. But when prompted on the nature of the romance in the book, specifically the romanticisation of youthful suicide, Jeff responded, "The narrator is overly romantic, poetic and dramatic, but isn't ennobled by the love. It's actually a more deluded kind of love." In fact, it didn't take a lot of digging to find the root inspiration for this book. When asked what made you want to explore teenage obsession and voyeurism through the male narrators, Jeff responded that it was not a conscious decision, but rather he had met a young woman who was a babysitter for his nephew. This young woman told him that she and her sisters had all tried to take their own lives. I took that idea and I cast it back to my own adolescence, and I imagined, what if there were some girls doing that when I was growing up? I found this answer especially difficult to parse. There is some grey area for sure in taking a story that isn't yours and selling it or retelling it. I'm sure we would have far fewer stories in the world if people literally didn't pass them on, word of mouth. But I found it a huge shame to read that this real life situation had been taken and manipulated as a way for Jeff to look back on and examine his own growing manhood through the lens of a tragedy he had merely heard about in passing and immediately thought, I wonder what would happen if this was also about me. What if there were girls doing that when I was growing up isn't so much an excuse to examine the girls as it is to see a romanticised tragedy through your own perspective, and then to write that, no matter how deluded you make your main character, is to frame someone else's tragedy as your own character arc. The irony of having these men in their 30s or 40s lusting after these mysterious teenage girls and their own tragic suicides whilst writing a book based on the experience of teenage girls you will never know nor understand is quite potent. Jeff was asked, people think of teenage boys as lustful dogs with permanent boners, but the narrators are more tender than that, aren't they? And he responds, yes, my memory of being a teenage boy was as being romantic and poetic rather than a lustful dog, so I think there might be a misconception of what many teenage boys are like. And I definitely disagree with this assertion. Jeff does write a kind of deluded love in his novel, and he does spend a lot of time poring over the mysterious and ungraspable beauty of these women his characters wouldn't be able to pick out of a lineup. The sheer amount of pages dedicated to stealing and worshipping used tampons, discussing the groping of adolescent corpses, romanticizing watching them in the shower, watching them use the toilet. It is a heavily lustful and exploitative book. Just because it's written in dainty, wistful prose doesn't make it poetic. The irony of his statement where he asserts that young men are much more pure and romantic than we could ever understand, whilst writing some of the most uncomfortable passages about women in literature that I have ever encountered, describing them as wet, hungry beasts, is definitely there. Poetry and disgusting lust aren't mutually exclusive. And you've actually made me think that younger men are more disgusting than I always thought they were, so thanks for that. I struggled to reconcile this new insight into my existing reading of the book after that. I felt disillusioned, not like angry, but more like when you walk up the stairs and you don't realise there's an extra one, so you just trip forwards in the dark like an idiot, like the world's fallen out beneath your feet. It was a stutter in my experience with the Virgin Suicides that left me disoriented, unsure of how I really felt, and actually kind of feeling a little bit betrayed. Reading back over the book in preparation for making this video, I no longer observed it with like awe and marvel. I no longer felt like I was being directly spoken to, because the bits that I thought were satire weren't satire. It's psychobabble, sure. The deluded love, sure. But the objectification? The sleazy, lingering, lustful observations made on poor young women? Not satire. In fact, they were so not satire that the author himself said in interviews that it wasn't lust at all. Just an albeit misplaced but romantic, poetic, and dramatic love. It was like he didn't even think the words on the page were uncomfortable, and I felt like it was a shame. Rather than feeling seen, I felt watched, observed. I felt sickly. I no longer felt like I was stood side by side with Jeff, looking at this scene together with a knowing smile and nod to one another, but rather I felt like me and the Lisbon girls were on one side of the partition, with Jeff and the boys on the other. Men aren't lustful dogs, I hear him say as I watch the boys dig through the bins for used tampons, and their older counterparts imagine the girls while they're having sex with their wives. They're romantic people, they're poetic. I watch the boys fantasize about the girls shitting in their private bathroom, talk about groping the dead girls in their coffins at their open casket funerals, and hear the disgusting animal ways they describe their sexuality, and I wonder what Jeff would consider lust if this is merely poetry to him. Even then, once I stepped back a bit further, I began to notice more of the cracks. Most notably in the alien characterization of the girls, and most specifically in Lux's behaviour shortly before taking her own life. While her sisters are literally hanging themselves, overdosing on pills, and sticking their heads in the oven in the adjacent room, Lux invites the boys over to help them escape. Having gathered these boys in the kitchen around her, she flirtily makes to unbuckle the belt of one of them, behaving as though she's going to give them a blowjob, after which point she pauses, mumbles to herself about it being a bad time, and flaunts off into the other room. Like, I'm sorry Lux, I know you've been through a lot, but why are you being written like Catwoman? So much of their behaviour becomes a spectacle for the men watching, through which their own character arcs are boosted. These girls don't develop in any meaningful way during this book, beyond losing the will to live over the course of a few miserable years, but their actions serve to mould the men around them, inspire them. They are these men's muses. Lux teaches Trip how to feel love, grief, fascination, misery, depression. She has sex on rooftops, allowing the boys to voyeuristically observe and understand her sexuality, whilst also giving them something to keep in the wank bank for the next 40 years. The girls are trotted out to be homecoming dates for boys whose names they don't know, and Therese specifically describes as raffled off. Whoever affixed the flowers to the dress got the girl. They die in front of these young gentlemen who serve as their audience, and then the young gentlemen are then very affected and tell us for a long time just how affected they are, and not for the sake of satire, no, for the sake of poetic, dramatic, romantic love. Still, people have taken this work and made it their own in many ways. Sofia Coppola, the director of the Virgin Suicides movie adaptation, definitely seems to get these girls even more so than Jeff, despite not having created them herself, understanding the breadth of their death and grief and sadness. While Jeff's examination, however well-intentioned, circles the drain on satirizing the spectacle of these girls and accidentally actually just making them a spectacle in their own right, Coppola goes to great lengths to showcase the tragedy. And it's a consideration that I've never had to make before. Coppola did these girls justice in her movie. Are they Coppola's girls now? Not really. Would I be more comfortable if they were? Yes. But when reading the book, her girls are injected onto the page for me now. It improved my reading. It's not the original intention. Does that matter? Are you allowed to ignore the negatives of a book, or is it something that you always have to carry with you in the back of your mind? At what point is ignorance bliss? These themes are explored in the Lit Hub article, Does the Virgin Suicides Hold Up 25 Years Later?, highlighting that we often return to pieces of once beloved fiction with a newfound state of awareness, and although that can ruin some rereadings of old fiction, it would be willfully ignorant to intentionally refuse to re-engage with old fiction solely on the basis that it might not read the same way anymore. This article argues that the book does stand up well, purely because of how it is portrayed through the male gaze, and I don't think I disagree with that. Bad. Reading this as a flat satire from the perspective of a pack of deluded middle-aged men looking back on some school children they still imagine when having sex with their wives, it is really good. Looking at this in a vacuum as a piece of text, it's great. However, when we look closer at the way these women are actually characterized, their actions actually written, we see a group of stereotypes written purely to titillate. These women are fantasy for the author. According to an article by Days Digital, a lot of women review this book and occasionally the accompanying movie and remark that it makes them feel seen, and in my experience I definitely felt that way myself at first, before the bubble popped for me. Looking closely, their feelings revolved mostly around the way their own mental health was swept away by uncaring medical professionals who attributed their deteriorating mental health as some woman issue. To quote from the article directly, Rachel, 23, was intrigued after stumbling across one of the book's most famous quotes, where a dismissive doctor tells Cecilia that she isn't old enough to have serious mental issues, prompting her to say, "Obviously, doctor, you've never been a 13-year-old girl." Rachel, who was 13 when she was first admitted to hospital while suffering from anorexia and depression, recalls how the quote deeply resonated with her. "I ordered a copy of the book from eBay the same day," she says. Upon reading the book, Rachel says it made her feel seen as a teenage girl whose mental health problems were not taken very seriously. "As a tween, even though my parents themselves were really great and understanding, most people were quite unsympathetic to my mental health," she says. "They brushed it off as a phase or assumed I was merely looking for attention." Another reader, Habby, 22, had a similar experience and also discovered the book through Tumblr after seeing the same Cecilia quote. "I don't think girlhood is ever treated as a serious topic which is worth exploring. Everything teenage girls like is usually made fun of, or there to be ridiculed," she says, and then you had this story. I don't disagree with these quotes at all. As I'll discuss as we go, and spoilers I will likely conclude with, literature seems to just be what you get out of it. My friends and I often joke that every video game is someone's favourite video game, even fucking Limbo, God forbid. But the root of that is that different experiences speak to all of us, and Jeff's examination of mental health clearly speaks to these women, and rightly so. While it seems extreme to the point of parody, it's definitely valid that many teenagers or young struggling with their mental health will likely have had their issues hand-waved away at least once in their lifetime. There is definitely a self-awareness in the book in regards to the attitudes of the men that voice the central narration of the Virgin Suicides. The assumptions about the women and the finger-pointing are definitely over the top. The conclusions drawn about their deaths are pantomime, and while clearly satire, actually stick out so horrendously that they are fairly awkward in the narratives. But that doesn't mean they're not accurate. For the main characters, their love is deluded, yes, but particularly with Lux and Cecilia, the actual world as portrayed isn't a warped impression of them, seen through the male gaze. Cecilia wears a wedding dress every day. Lux faints like she's going to give out blowjobs to a group of men like a femme fatale, giving her sisters time to take their own lives. While we do occasionally see moments where the girl's actions are romanticized in juxtaposition to the non-romantic reality, such as when the boys see the sisters peering out of a single window in the family home and say Mary blew us a kiss or wiped her mouth, we just as frequently see manic pixie dream girl behaviour done off their own backs unprompted. In fact, I saw these girls referenced in articles many times as manic pixie dream girls, which seems an odd description for a bunch of young women going through a mental health crisis so extreme that it kills them. Manic pixie dream girl obviously referring to the specific definition, bubbly, shallow, cinematic creatures that exist solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and infinite mysteries and adventures. Or a pretty, outgoing, wacky female lead whose sole purpose is to help broody men lighten up and enjoy their lives. And yet that is not an inaccurate description of these girls by any metric. Yes, we see them through the male gaze, so there is exaggeration and unreliability, but we also see moments where the girls are written clearly, and in those moments of honesty, they are the aforementioned shallow creatures, plonked in the middle of the scene, giving their performance purely for the emotional development of the men observing, and secondarily for their, horniness, and they can remember it later. While I did feel like aspects of my own adolescence were being perceived so well by a man that I had never met, that I walked away from certain segments feeling truly understood, I just as often walked away feeling misinterpreted, uncomfortable, insidiously overestimated, watched, vulnerable. Lux, a 14-year-old, takes middle-aged men up onto the roof where she has a mattress waiting and has sex with them at night. Lux wasn't allowed out of the house. How did she organise midnight rendezvous with some network of accountants? Due to this, Lux is framed as the quote-unquote manic pixie dream girl nymphomaniac who has loads of sex in order to feel something, but her sexuality is somehow considered dirty and ugly. This is shown as Lux's sexuality is described through smell and claustrophobia and strange dank wetness, with emphasis on her pubic hair and her vagina as described with bestial words like it's an open-mouthed hungry dog with its tongue out, teethed, and she's the female equivalent of being stuck in a hot car on a humid day. Despite the effort to highlight the delusion of the romanticization of the girls, they were definitely written in ways that served to cultivate that delusion. And so they became props used to excite the reader. Even trying to figure out when the suicides would come served as like a dangling thread that keeps you reading. They are vehicles that drive tragedy and romance through which the boys gain a greater insight into themselves. Not humans written to be understood, even from a distance or through a lens of satire. And as suggested by Jeff's interviews, that wasn't his intention, so it just kind of happened. It's difficult, isn't it? If I'd never had that conversation with my book club mates, I would have churned through the Virgin Suicides and walked away still thoroughly convinced of its insightful and satirical nature. I would have walked away feeling seen and with a deep sense of admiration towards a man who I felt really did just get me. And, like, yeah, I would have had no idea the real nature of it. I'd have walked away with my own interpretation and it would have felt pure and correct and complete, but it would have been one of ignorance, and that's not really something I can hide from. Like, not learning about something purely because I don't want the thing ruined for me is an active act of ignorance. That is me specifically not wanting to know because I know that it will have bad returns. And yet you can learn about the background and still enjoy it for the bits that spoke to you, can't you? But is the insight you gained still enough to ruin the entire picture? And was the brief feeling of being understood enough to look back on the media favourably, even if in retrospect you know that you weren't being understood? I normally try to end my videos with a conclusion, be it this was shit or this wasn't shit. You know, there's normally a concluding statement that I feel wraps my discussion in enough black and white terms that I'll be able to tick the video off, wrap it up, and send it out into the world to see who agrees with me and who doesn't. But in this instance, I don't really have an answer. Was the experience of this book ruined for me by understanding the logic of the author, the intention behind each scene, and the reality of his own attitude towards the women he knows and the women he writes? A little bit, yeah. Like, now that I know that, I can't ignore it, and it's changed my opinion. Was it ruined for me as much as it was ruined for members of my book club, who took huge issue with some of the details that I felt a little bit more favourably towards? No, I don't think so. I think they hated it, whereas I just kind of merely dislike it. Was it ruined for the girls Rachel, Habby, and Ruby, you know, from the Days Digital article, who found a new peace within themselves and their own mental health issues, and felt seen and understood by somebody who encapsulated their experiences perfectly? Absolutely not. That's still theirs to feel validated by. I feel like I've changed a lot personally since I started this channel 2 or 3 years ago. I definitely always felt like everything needed an answer and assumed that the media would affect us all equally enough that I could provide an answer within an hour-long video, which when you consider it is kind of a preposterous assumption. And I don't know whether it was my own personal growth or simply because this book is such a remarkable example of literature that it is so contradictory in source, function, and success that I've never seen it replicated anywhere else, but I don't have an answer for this one either. Just something to think about, I suppose. Thank you for watching. This video idea has been sat with me since January, when we had our book club meeting, and it's been nice to finally get all my thoughts out in one place. At first I was in the This Book is Satire club, then I was in the Jeff is a Weirdo club, but now I think I'm sitting somewhere a little bit more central, for better or worse. I don't think Jeff writes women well, and I don't think he was the person to tell this story on behalf of those poor fictional women, but in terms of writing the male gaze, he's pretty spot on, even if he himself doesn't actually grasp how spot on he is. I want to thank my patrons for their support, and I want to thank you all for being here and listening to my thoughts and ramble. Particularly HM, Liquid Pliskin, Carl DeRocha, Bile Hamar Hufuth, Brendan Sidereal, Brian Bullock, Brody Cullen, Fosh, Alice Teeters, Sam Jones, Julia, and Carissa Fulcher for being my highest tier patrons. Thank you very much for your support. Have an amazing week, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.